Getting What You Came For, The Smart Student's Guide to Earning a Master's or PhD by Robert L. Peters, PhD, book review. So this one might get a little bit personal, talking about my own story. When I was in my late 20s, I was teaching English in Japan, and it's one of those things where you go and you teach for 1 year just to kind of figure out what you're going to do with your life. And then, as happens to a lot of people, I ended up staying for 2 years and 3 years and 4 years because, you think I'll just teach English for a year and then I'll figure out what I want to do with my life. But you get to the end of that year and you really have no clue what you want to do with your life. But as I was trying to figure this out, I got this idea that maybe I would go back to graduate school for history and get a master's or PhD in history. I did my undergraduate in history, and while I was in Japan, I found myself more and more spending my free time reading history books. And I guess if you've been watching the book reviews on this channel, a number of them are book reviews of history books. They're not scholarly history books. They're armchair history books, popular history books. But I had this idea that you should find your profession should be what you love, right? This is what they used to tell us back in school. I'm not sure if they still say this, but when I was growing up, they said, okay, find whatever you're interested in and make that your profession. And I thought, well, if I spend all my free time reading history books, and maybe I should go back to school for history and make that my profession. So I had this idea that I was going to go back to graduate school for history. Now, in retrospect, this seems incredibly naive that I ever thought this could be a realistic career path. But I think maybe to be fair to myself, well, I don't know, let me know if I'm wrong. I think there was this idea when I was younger that this was a realistic career path. And then it's become more evident that this is not realistic at all. I think for a couple of factors. Number one is the bottom has just fallen out of the academic job market, and this is very apparent in a way that maybe it wasn't apparent in the late 90s when I was in school. And then I think number two, just with the internet and everything, more and more people have put their horror stories of trying to make it with a PhD in humanities or English or something like that. And these stories have been in much more circulation that this is just not a viable job market. Or I don't know, maybe it was always thus and I was just very naive when I was younger. But anyways, I was considering getting a PhD in history, and a friend of mine said, if you're interested in it, you've got to read this book. He recommended this book title to me, and I ordered it off of Amazon. And I got about a quarter of the way through this book, and it talked me right out of getting a PhD in history. So the book paints a very dismal picture of getting a PhD in the humanities. It paints a picture of long degree programs and a very dismal job market afterwards. So I had thought, again maybe naively, that it would be 4 years. 2 years for the masters, 2 more years for the doctors, which is how these programs used to be advertised. But it turns out that's not even close to true. A PhD in history, for example, it takes a median time of 8.6 years just as a registered student. He says in the book that actually most people who do this end up taking time off for personal or financial reasons. So if you factor in that time, it ends up being 11.3 years. I was in my late 20s when I was doing these, when I was looking into this. I thought, boy, if I start now, be in my early 40s by the time I finish this. So yeah, that talked me right out of it. And From other sources I've heard, I don't think these numbers are entirely inaccurate. I think this does seem to be the median time it takes to finish these advanced doctorate degrees. That being said, actually, let me throw in my 2 cents here. I find myself now, I'm still teaching English abroad, and I often run into people who are much younger than me now, people who are like I used to be, 23, 24, just teaching English for a couple of years, and some of them talk about going back to school and, you know, getting their doctorates in history or English or comparative literature or all these humanities degrees that are probably useless. But this is my perspective now, being much older. You know, when I was in my 20s, I was so terrified of going into this program and actually wasting my time. But you know, I ended up wasting a lot of time anyways, just being abroad and teaching English and not having any clear direction in my life. And to a certain extent, I think if you're in your 20s and you're young, you've got a certain leeway here. You've got time you can afford to waste. So certainly at my age now, I would never want to go for a PhD in history. But if you're in your 20s, I think it's good to follow your dreams. And if it turns out later that you spend 6 years getting the degree and you're not able to find a job afterwards, well, at least you know. It's better to kind of try something and fail than never to try at all, maybe. The only caveat I would make to this, I've been watching a lot of Dave Ramsey lately, and people have been calling in with horror stories about how they're in horrible debt for their whole lives because of their student loans. Don't go into debt doing it. But if you can get it financed, or you can find a way to get it financed, then why not? Give it a try. See if it works. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, my sister got her PhD in linguistics, and she was able to get it financed. She applied for funding, she got funding, she got stipends for it. I think that may be more true of some fields than others. I'm not sure it would be true of a history degree. But yeah, if she was actually not able to find a job in her field at the end of it, which I think is true for a lot of people who do PhDs in the humanities. But you know, she says, I don't regret any of it. It was interesting, I got an education, I learned good study skills and discipline, and then she had no debt at the end of it to pay off. And you know, it took up a big chunk of her 20s, but she was focused and she was doing something, as opposed to me, who was teaching English in Japan during my 20s, where I was unfocused and maybe not learning a lot. Actually, that's unfair. I learned stuff while I was there. That's a different subject for a different video. Sorry, that was a long digression. To get back to the subject of this book here, the author Robert L. Peters claims that if you follow his book, you have a much better chance of beating the odds and getting out on time. So even though it's 11.3 years median for a history degree, it says if you follow this advice in the book, you have a lot better chance of getting out in the 4 years. But then he paints a very dismal picture of the academic job market, where a lot of PhDs are either struggling to find employment or overworked at low-paying jobs. And again, I think this is something that I'm more and more aware of. I've seen the stories on people's blogs and on YouTube's. I have a couple friends who did advanced degrees in the humanities, and yeah, can't find jobs in their field, etc. So all of that talked me out of getting an advanced degree in history. I did, however, read through the whole book, just, I don't know, for the sake of it, and it was interesting and well written. Robert L. Peters, somewhat surprisingly, he writes so well. I was thinking he must be from the humanities, like, in English or history or something. But he's actually from the sciences. But he's obviously learned a thing or two about how to write a readable paragraph. Because the book reads very well, and he even gives a chapter in the book on how to write better. So it is readable. Now, a lot of the fascination of this book is somewhat of the fascination of a train wreck. So he has a lot of anecdotes throughout this book, both his own personal anecdotes and the anecdotes of people he knows or he's interviewed. So he amasses a great collection of the horrors of grad school life, which is unnerving if you're a potential student, but it's also, it can be fascinating to read. Again, somewhat the fascination of a train wreck, but there is interest in here. I ended up, again, to get back to my personal story, not going to grad school for a history degree, but going back to grad school for linguistics, applied linguistics, and to continue what I had been doing, teaching English abroad, but just doing it with more credentials. And all the pros and cons of that decision will perhaps be a different video for a different post. But I was able to use a lot of the information in this book. He talks a lot about how to write a thesis, how to deal with the stress, how to organize your time. And while I was back to school for doing the linguistics degree, I reread this book, and specifically the chapters on writing your thesis, how to write well, and I did my best to apply it. I struggled throughout that year with problems with organization and problems with procrastination. And this book didn't entirely help me overcome all those problems, but it gave me some good tips. Also, his tips on writing well apply whether you are doing a thesis or not, or whether it's kind of good general advice on writing well that I tried to use when I was in grad school, but also I've took some of those tips just generally for writing book reviews on my blog. There are some just good general advice on writing well. So yeah, all that being said, I can't really review this book thoroughly because, well, I can't really comment on the accuracy of everything in this book because the degree I did was not meant to get into the academic job market. It was just to be a better qualified English teacher and maybe to get a higher status of jobs teaching English. Some of the advice here he is talking about kind of making connections in the academic world and getting your name out there and stuff like that. And somebody who's maybe more in the academic world can comment on the quality of that advice. But what I can say is that it's well written, it's interesting to read. I got some useful tips in here about organizing time and writing well. And I got some insight into the academic job market, even though I ended up not pursuing that. But I ended up not pursuing that in large part because of the advice in this book. So, yeah, if you are at all considering going back to school for an advanced degree, I'd recommend this book. It's interesting, it's well written, a lot of useful information.